What would you do if a murder was announced before it even happened? In a quiet village, a chilling notice in the newspaper sent shockwaves through the community. It read, "A murder is announced and will take place tonight at Blackwood House." No one believed it until the lights went out and the first shot was fired. But who planned it? Why was it announced? And who will survive the night? In the heart of a quiet village, where life moved with a slow, unhurried rhythm, a peculiar announcement appeared in the local paper room that would leave its readers with a chill running down their spines. The notice, printed in stark black ink, read, "A murder is announced and will take place on Friday, the 29th of October at Blackwood House at 7 p.m. Friends accept this, the only intimation." The words seemed to leap off the page, their cold finality hanging in the air like an omen. No signature, no explanation, just an unsettling declaration of doom. The villagers, used to the tranquility of their peaceful existence, found themselves in a strange state of unease. Was it a sick joke, a twisted prank, or something more sinister? Whispers spread like wildfire, each person trying to make sense of what was to come. And yet, the mystery only deepened. Blackwood House, perched on the edge of the village like an old forgotten sentinel, became the focus of every conversation. The grand estate, hidden behind overgrown hedges and shadowed trees, had always been a subject of intrigue. Its owner, the reclusive Eleanor Blackwood, was known to be a woman of wealth, but her past was shrouded in mystery. She seldom ventured beyond the towering gates, and rumors swirled stories of a tragic past, secrets buried deep within the mansion's walls. No one truly knew the woman who lived there, but everyone had a theory. Some claimed she was hiding from her past. Others said she was keeping something, perhaps someone locked away inside. For Eleanor, the notice was as much a shock as it was a puzzle. She sat at her grand dining table, the evening light casting long shadows across the dark wooden floors. Her fingers trembled slightly as she read the words, but she was not one to be easily rattled. She had long learned to live with the unknown. Still, a dark intuition stirred in her chest. Why had this notice appeared? Why had someone gone through the trouble of announcing a murder in advance? Who was behind it, and why? But Eleanor, ever the dignified hostess, knew that curiosity would never get her the answers she sought. She quickly composed herself, her mind already working to make sense of this cryptic message. After all, she had lived through worse. She had weathered storms, faced betrayals, and survived tragedies most could only imagine. Whoever had sent the notice, whoever had written that chilling line, had no idea who they were dealing with. She would not cower. She would not let fear grip her. Yet, as the night drew closer, something began to change in the air around Blackwood House. The once silent village seemed to hold its breath, and the creeping mist that often lingered over the grounds felt heavier, almost like a warning. A foreboding sense of inevitability hung over the house, as if the very walls were waiting for the impending darkness to arrive. The evening of Friday, the 29th of October, approached with the same calmness the village was accustomed to, but the atmosphere was anything but normal. The villagers watched in uneasy anticipation, their eyes fixed on Blackwood House. Eleanor, undeterred, prepared for a dinner party she had planned for her closest friends and acquaintances. They were to be her guests that evening, though none of them knew why. They had all received an invitation, a request to join her for a gathering at 7 p.m. No mention of the strange notice. No mention of the warning, just a simple invitation to dinner. Among the guests were Dora, her loyal but eccentric companion, who never failed to bring a strange energy to any room. Patrick, a charming yet enigmatic man who had claimed to be an old friend of Eleanor's, though he never quite seemed to fit the role. Julia, a distant relative whose behavior had grown increasingly erratic in the days leading up to the gathering. And Dr. Simon, a local physician who had a sharp mind, but whose past dealings with Eleanor were cloaked in secrecy. Each guest had their own reason for attending, and each carried with them their own set of secrets. As the clock ticked closer to 7 p.m., Eleanor found herself gazing out at the swirling mist that blanketed her estate. A sudden chill ran through her, and for the first time that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to unfold. She couldn't explain it, perhaps. It was the sense of anticipation, or the eerie nature of the cryptic message, but the weight of the night's events pressed on her. The guests began arriving, their faces a mix of confusion and curiosity, none of them aware that they had been drawn into something far darker than a mere dinner party. At precisely 7 p.m., the doors to Blackwood House were locked. The final guest arrived. And then, just as the clock struck the hour, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the grand dining room into a suffocating darkness. A heavy silence filled the room until a sudden, blinding light pierced the blackness. A masked man, holding a torch that burned bright enough to sear the very air, stepped into the room. His presence was as unexpected as it was terrifying. His voice, cold and commanding, rang out as he demanded compliance. His words, "No one move, no one make a sound," echoed through the space, sending a wave of fear through the guests. And then, as the lights flickered once more, a single shot rang out, sharp and deafening. When the room returned to light, the masked man lay dead on the floor, his body lifeless and cold. Eleanor, blood staining her dress, stood gravely wounded, her wide eyes reflecting shock, confusion, and fear. But the question remained, who had orchestrated this deadly spectacle? And why? What had begun as a strange announcement now promised only one thing: terror. The night had only just begun. The setup. The clock struck 7 p.m., and a strange stillness had settled over Blackwood House. The once silent village outside seemed to hold its breath as the guests arrived, each one unaware of the chilling events about to unfold within the grand, shadowed walls. Eleanor Blackwood stood in the grand foyer, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon as the mist outside crept further into the estate. She had made her preparation, setting a lavish dinner table and ensuring the evening would be memorable. But tonight, as she looked around at the gathering of her closest friends and acquaintances, she couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. Her guests, too, sensed it, though none would speak of it aloud. Dora, Eleanor's loyal companion, entered the room first, her every movement an eccentric blend of energy and oddity. She was a woman whose laughter was always too loud, whose presence always too bright, yet who seemed to have a heart that beat in time with Eleanor's. But tonight, her usual bubbly demeanor was absent, replaced by a quiet wariness. She had noticed the strange announcement, of course, and though she put on a brave face, Eleanor knew her friend was as uneasy as she was. Patrick followed, the charming man whose smile could melt even the coldest of hearts, though Eleanor had always wondered how much of it was genuine. He had a habit of disappearing for days, weeks even, without explanation, yet always returning as though nothing had happened. A man of secrets, and tonight, his usual confidence seemed to flicker in the face of the unknown. Julia, a distant relative, arrived last. She was elegant but distant, her eyes far away, as though she was carrying a weight only she could feel. Since her arrival earlier that afternoon, Eleanor had noticed a strange tension around Julia. Her eyes darted nervously from shadow to shadow, and her conversations were short and clipped. Something about her made Eleanor uneasy. Was it fear, paranoia, or something more sinister? And then there was Dr. Samant, the local physician, who always seemed to know more than he let on. Intelligent and calculating, he had often been a sounding board for Eleanor's musings over the years. But tonight, he seemed more distant than ever, his gaze flickering toward the door every so often, as if he were anticipating something he wasn't willing to share. What was it that he feared? And why did he insist on treating Eleanor's wounds, even though he knew very little about her history? As the guests exchanged polite pleasantries and settled around the dinner table, the atmosphere grew heavier. It wasn't just the weight of the strange announcement that hung in the air, but the palpable sense of something waiting. Something about tonight felt off, as though they were all playing a part in a drama that had been written for them long before their arrival. Eleanor couldn't ignore the prickling sensation running down her spine. She had felt it all day, sense of inevitability, as though the night had already been mapped out and there was no escaping its course. Cliffhanger ending. Then, just as the conversation began to lull, the lights flickered. It was a brief flicker, nothing more than a flick of the switch. But it was enough to make everyone pause, eyes darting around in confusion. Was it a power outage, a malfunction? But before anyone could voice their concern, the room was plunged into an oppressive darkness. A cold, sudden rush of air swept through the room, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, measured, approaching. No one moved, no one spoke. The darkness seemed to suffocate them all, the silence thick and suffocating. Then, without warning, a blinding light flared to life, cutting through the darkness like a blade. A masked figure holding a torch that burned with an unnatural intensity appeared in the doorway. His face was hidden, his presence overwhelming. His voice, deep and commanding, echoed through the room, cold and terrifying. No one move, no one make a sound. The guests sat frozen in place, their eyes wide, hearts pounding in their chests. Was this part of the evening's entertainment? A strange, twisted game. But no one could have anticipated the terror that would follow. The masked man's torch illuminated the space, casting long, sinister shadows that danced across the walls. Without warning, he raised a weapon, and before anyone could react, the unmistakable sound of a gunshot ripped through the room. The noise was deafening. Time seemed to stop. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the lights flickered back on. The guests blinked in the sudden brightness, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. The masked man lay lifeless on the floor, a pool of blood quickly spreading beneath him. His torch had rolled out of his hand, and the room was filled with the scent of smoke and fear. The guests looked at each other, their faces pale, but it was Eleanor who stood at the center of it all, blood staining her gown, her hand clutching her side where the bullet had struck. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock, but there was something else there, a recognition, a knowing. She knew who had done this. She knew what was happening. But who had done this, and why? Was it a cruel joke, a warning? Or was this just the beginning of something far darker? As the room buzzed with confusion and fear, Eleanor's gaze locked with Patrick's. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, and something passed between them. Something unspoken, something dangerous. But before anyone could ask the question hanging in the air, before they could even begin to make sense of the night's events, the door to the dining room slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them all inside. And the question echoed in the darkness. What happens next? The investigation begins. The air inside Blackwood House was thick with confusion and fear as the guests huddled in the dining room. The once grand space now felt suffocating, the walls closing in with each passing second. Eleanor lay unconscious, her breath shallow but steady, her body swathed in blood, her eyes fluttering as if she might awaken at any moment. The masked figure, now lifeless on the floor, had been dragged aside, but the mystery that lingered in the air was far from over. The police were called immediately, but as soon as the authorities arrived, it became painfully clear that this was no ordinary case. The crime scene was baffling. No weapon had been found near the masked man's body, and no fingerprints were left behind. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle that indicated a prior altercation. And most perplexing of all, the guests, who had witnessed the entire ordeal, couldn't agree on what had happened. Detective Olivia Hart stood at the edge of the room, her sharp eyes scanning the faces of the people who had once been friends, now suspects. She was a woman of few words, but her presence commanded attention. Her demeanor was methodical, each movement deliberate as she took note of every detail, the way each person fidgeted, the nervous glances exchanged, the stuttering responses to her questions. She knew something wasn't right here. There was no such thing as an ordinary murder, and this was anything but ordinary. She turned first to Dora, who was sitting on the edge of her seat, her hands clasped together in a death grip. Dora's face was pale, her wide eyes darting around, as though she might bolt at any moment. She was breathing quickly, her voice trembling as she recounted the events. "I swear I saw someone," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Right before the lights went out, I saw a figure, a shadow. Someone slipped out of the room. They were quick, too quick. I don't know who it was, but I saw them. I saw it." The room went still. Dora's claim was both chilling and confusing. Everyone had been frozen in place when the lights went out, hadn't they? The masked figure had appeared almost immediately after, and the shots had come soon after that. Had someone really left the room, or was Dora's panic clouding her judgment? Detective Hart nodded, her eyes never leaving Dora's face as she processed the information. Then she turned her gaze to Patrick, who had been unusually quiet up until now. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes avoiding the detective's gaze. "Patrick," Hart said calmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife, "where were you when the lights went out?" Patrick hesitated for a long moment, his lips pressed tight. Then he spoke, his voice smooth but guarded. "I was at the table, just like everyone else. There's nothing to add. I don't know what happened in the dark. But I didn't shoot anyone. I swear it." His words were firm, but there was a slight tremor in his hands. His alibi didn't fully add up. He had been sitting next to Julia, hadn't he? And yet, no one had seen him move. No one had seen anyone move during the blackout. How could he be so sure he hadn't been the one to fire the shot? Detective Hart's instincts were honed over years of experience, and she didn't trust his certainty. Something about it didn't sit right. Her gaze shifted to Julia, who had been unnervingly calm throughout the entire ordeal. She sat motionless, her expression unreadable, as though the chaos swirling around her had no impact at all. It was as though she were watching a scene unfold, rather than living it. "Julia," Detective Hart asked, her voice sharp but probing, "what do you remember? When the lights went out, what happened?" Julia's eyes remained fixed on the detective, her lips barely twitching into what could have been a smile. "I don't remember anything unusual," she said, her tone almost too calm, too composed. "It was just a power outage, wasn't it? I was at the table. I didn't see anyone move. I don't know what happened afterward. I was too distracted." Distracted. The word hung in the air, pregnant with implication. What was Julia distracted by? Was it fear, guilt, or something far darker? Her calmness, in the face of such terror, made her seem suspicious, too calm. And there was something else, the flicker of something behind her eyes, something fleeting that could have been guilt, or maybe fear, if only for a second. Detective Hart studied her closely, then turned to the room. She noted the others' nervous glances exchanged between Dora and Patrick, the strange tension in the air. Everyone was on edge, but there was something unspoken, a subtle shift in the room, as though the guests were hiding something. The deeper she dug, the more she realized that no one here was as innocent as they seemed. Cliffhanger ending. As Olivia continued her questions, the air in the room grew thick, each word a thread that drew everyone closer to a truth none of them wanted to face. She was about to speak again when the front door, which had been locked after the police arrived, suddenly creaked open with a slow, agonizing screech. The wind howled through the cracks, and for a moment, everyone froze. The door was open, but there was no one there. Detective Hart's heart skipped a beat. Had someone entered, or had someone just slipped out? She turned back to the guests, her eyes narrowing. Someone in this room was lying. Someone in this room was hiding something, and she was about to find out who. But before she could take another step, a soft sound echoed through the hall. A whisper. Faint, just barely audible, but it was enough. Enough to send a shiver down her spine. "It's not over." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The lights flickered once more, and for a brief moment, the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, swallowing the room whole. Then silence. Complete, suffocating silence. What had just happened, and who had spoken those words? The investigation had only just begun, but it was already clear. The terror at Blackwood House was far from over. And now Olivia had to decide who could she trust. The first twist. The investigation was only beginning to reveal its layers, each more unsettling than the last. Detective Olivia Hart's mind raced as she examined the evidence, her sharp instincts tugging at something buried deep within the web of lies surrounding Blackwood House. The deeper she dug, the more she realized that nothing about this case was as it seemed. The more questions she asked, the more the truth slipped further out of reach. The first shocking revelation came when she learned the identity of the masked intruder. The man who had burst into the room, holding that blinding torch, wasn't some random criminal. His name was Marcus Fisher. He had a recorded dangerous one, a criminal with ties to underground syndicates and shady dealings. But what sent a cold chill down Olivia's spine was what she uncovered next. Marcus wasn't supposed to die. The report came through from the police forensics team, who had worked overnight to uncover any possible leads. Marcus had been hired recently by someone to stage a robbery. The idea was simple: create the illusion of a violent home invasion to frighten Eleanor, but leave her unharmed. A plan that, on paper, seemed almost too ordinary. It should have been just another case of insurance fraud, or a feigned robbery gone wrong. But then the plot thickened. Marcus was never supposed to be killed. Someone arranged this. Someone powerful. Olivia muttered under her breath. Her fingers traced the edges of a file on her desk. It was clear now that Marcus's death was part of a larger, far more complicated scheme. But who had hired him? And why kill him when he was just a pawn? The pieces didn't fit yet. They all pointed back to Blackwood House. With mounting unease, Olivia expanded her search into the world of Eleanor Blackwood's past. What had she been hiding? The more Olivia uncovered, the more she realized there was a dark cloud hanging over Eleanor's life, something no one had dared to speak about. Eleanor was not just a wealthy, eccentric woman with a fondness for mystery novels. She was set to inherit a fortune beyond anyone's imagination. Eleanor's uncle, Victor Blackwood, had been a billionaire industrialist, known for his ruthless dealings and a legacy steeped in secrecy. Eleanor had been estranged from him for years, ever since a family dispute that had split the once thriving estate into pieces. But just weeks before his death, Eleanor had received word that she would inherit everything, his entire fortune, a massive sum that would set her up for life. It seemed too perfect, too convenient, but the question was, why now? The villagers were quick to talk. Gossip spread like wildfire in such a small town. Whispers filled the air at the local pub, over garden fences, and in the narrow alleyways between Blackwood House and the surrounding cottages. According to the rumors, there was more to the inheritance than mere money. Some claimed Eleanor's uncle had been involved in something much darker, a connection to a tragic event that had occurred years ago, a mysterious fire that had consumed the Blackwood estate, killing several of the staff. The official cause of the fire was never found. The rumors told a different story, one of betrayal, hidden enemies, and a long-buried family curse. Eleanor had been too young to remember, but her family had always whispered about it. They said the fire was no accident, and some even believed it was connected to a betrayal that ran deep within the family's bloodline. Olivia's thoughts spun in a whirlwind as she pieced together the bits of information. Was Eleanor's inheritance truly a reward for her patience and familial loyalty? Or had someone in the shadows manipulated the entire situation for their own gain? And what role did Marcus Fisher play in all of this? He hadn't been killed by chance. There had been a reason. A hidden message in the violence, a warning perhaps. The more Olivia thought about it, the more certain she became that this wasn't just a murder, it was a well-crafted scheme, and Eleanor was at the center of it. But there were others too, in the shadows, waiting, watching. Patrick, Julia, Dora, Dr. Simon, they all had secrets, all had motives. What if they too were connected to this twisted tale of betrayal, family secrets, and dark pasts? Cliffhanger ending. But as Olivia sat back in her chair, trying to make sense of it all, a sudden chill ran down her spine. She looked up just in time to see the shadow of a figure pass by the window, moving swiftly and silently. Her hand reached for her phone instinctively, but before she could dial for backup, a soft knock echoed from the door. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone, not in this moment. Not after everything that had happened. Detective Hart. A voice called from the hallway, its tone smooth and calm but laced with something she couldn't place. Olivia stood, slowly, her instincts on high alert. She knew the voice. It belonged to Patrick. But something was different. Something in his voice felt off. Without waiting for her response, the door creaked open, and Patrick stepped inside. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice trembling. "It's about the night Eleanor was attacked. I know who hired Marcus Fisher, and I know why." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She stepped forward, her gaze locked on his. Who hired him? Patrick swallowed hard, his eyes flickering nervously toward the door as though someone might be listening. I can't say it out loud, but if I don't tell you now, it's too late. You'll never solve this. You have to trust me." The words hung heavy in the room, a promise of something bigger, something far more dangerous. And just as Olivia moved to press him for more, the lights flickered once more, plunging the room into darkness. In that brief moment of nothingness, something shifted, a sound of footstep then another. Someone was in the room, and they weren't alone. The air crackled with tension. What was coming? What had Patrick just revealed? And who else was hiding in the shadows of Blackwood House? The investigation had taken a terrifying turn, and now, more than ever, Olivia had to decide who could be trusted, because she was no longer just investigating a murder. She was hunting a shadow that had been lurking far longer than anyone had realized. The true game had just begun. The midpoint. As the investigation raged on, the atmosphere in Blackwood House grew even more suffocating. Every corner seemed to hold a new secret, every shadow whispered of dark deeds yet to be uncovered. But Detective Olivia Hart felt an unshakable weight pressing on her chest, knowing the truth was just beyond her reach, hidden behind layers of deception. It had been a tense 24 hours. The police had been working tirelessly, interrogating guests, re-examining evidence, and revisiting every thread that might lead to the killer's identity. Yet, just when Olivia thought she might finally catch a break, a new and horrific twist emerged. Dr. Simon, the local physician whose sharp mind had once been a key asset to the investigation, was found dead in his study. The cause was not immediately clear. At first, there was a suspicion that he had simply suffered a medical mishap or a stroke, but when the coroner's report came back, it was worse than anyone had imagined. Dr. Simon had been poisoned. The realization hit like a thunderclap. A second death, and this time there was no mask, no blinding torch, just the quiet, sinister finality of a lethal dose of poison. The shock rippled through the remaining guests like a gust of cold wind. Someone in the house, someone who had been there all along, was a murderer. But who? Eleanor, still recovering from her own wounds, could offer no help. Her mind seemed distant, clouded by the trauma, and every attempt to make sense of her past only seemed to drive her further into confusion. She had been too shaken by Marcus's death, and now Dr. Simon's murder, to be of any use to the investigation. The weight of her grief and fear had turned her into a ghost in her own home, her once sharp eyes now clouded with worry. So it was up to Detective Hart to continue piecing together the puzzle that was becoming more twisted with every passing hour. As she examined Dr. Simon's body, Olivia felt an uncomfortable sensation. The poison had been administered in such a subtle, almost methodical way, no signs of struggle, no frantic attempts to escape. It had been a calculated move, as if the killer had known exactly what they were doing, picking their moment with chilling precision. But why Dr. Simon? What did he have to do with the tangled web of secrets that surrounded Blackwood House? The police began to piece together the timeline. Dr. Simon had been one of the last to speak to Eleanor before the blackout. He had shown concern for her condition, but there was something more beneath his professional demeanor. Had he known something about Eleanor's past? Something so dangerous that it would lead to his own untimely death? Olivia's instincts told her that the key to understanding Dr. Simon's murder lay in the relationships between the guests, the people who had come to that dinner, all with their own dark secrets. Dora, the loyal companion, seemed too quiet after the doctor's death, but was her silence a shield, or was she hiding something more sinister? Patrick, the charming man who had become Eleanor's protector, looked more nervous than ever, as if something was weighing heavily on him. His quick, nervous glances toward the door made Olivia wonder whether he feared being caught in his own lie. Then there was Julia, who had been eerily calm throughout it all. Her demeanor had not once changed since the blackout, and Olivia began to wonder whether Julia's unshakable calm was a mask, a carefully crafted front hiding something darker beneath. But why? What did Julia know that she wasn't telling them? And that's when Olivia began to see it. The murders weren't just about money or revenge, they were personal. The poison wasn't meant to kill for financial gain, nor was it a crime of passion. Each death was a message tied to specific people. The killer was targeting certain individuals, but why? Olivia felt a creeping sensation, a gnawing feeling at the back of her mind, that the motives behind these deaths were linked to something far older than any of the guests had realized. Something far darker than the inheritance or the secrets of Blackwood House. She needed to find the connections, the key to understanding why these people were marked. And then, as she stared at the evidence in front of her, she noticed something that sent a chill through her veins, a pattern, one that had been present all along, but had gone unnoticed in the rush of investigation. The poison that had killed Dr. Simon was a rare, almost forgotten substantia chemical that had been used in a historical case involving a family tragedy. A case from decades ago, one that had been buried beneath years of gossip, lies, and broken memories. Cliffhanger ending. The realization hit Olivia like a wave. The murders weren't just about these guests at all. They were part of a deeper, darker story, a story that had begun long before any of them had stepped foot in Blackwood House. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her heart sinking as she read the message. "It's happening again." Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't need to ask who the message was from. It was Patrick. But what was happening again? What did he mean? Before she could react, there was a knock at the door. A sharp, insistent knock. Olivia's pulse quickened as she turned toward the sound. Who could it be now? The murderer, a new victim. As she moved to open the door, the lights flickered once more. The world seemed to stop. Everything went black. And in that crushing silence, Olivia heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, low, deliberate, coming closer. The final act. Detective Olivia Hart knew the endgame was here. The storm raged outside Blackwood House, thunder rumbling like a war drum in the distance. Inside the grand, dimly lit library, she stood before the remaining guests, Julia, Patrick, Dora, and Eleanor. The tension was palpable, thick enough to suffocate. Each face was painted with a mixture of fear and defiance, but Olivia's eyes were sharp, her resolve unyielding. The truth was close, and she was ready to rip it from the shadows. "Let's cut to the chase," Olivia said, her voice slicing through the oppressive silence. "Someone in this room has blood on their hands, and I intend to find out who." The suspects exchanged wary glances, the weight of the evening pressing down on them. Julia, ever composed, finally broke the silence. "I'll admit something," she said, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "Marcus Fisher and we were once engaged." Gasps echoed around the room. "It was years ago, before any of this. He wasn't always the man you've painted him to be. Marcus had dreams, ambitions, but life twisted him. He turned into someone I didn't recognize. I left him. And yet, Olivia interjected, her tone cold. You neglected to mention this crucial detail earlier. Julia's eyes narrowed. Because it didn't matter. I had nothing to do with his death, Detective. Marcus made his own enemies. I wasn't one of them. Olivia studied her for a moment, then turned her attention to Patrick, whose usually confident demeanor was cracking. Sweat beaded on his brow as he avoided Olivia's piercing gaze. And you, Patrick, Olivia said, stepping closer. You've been eager to deflect suspicion onto everyone else, but your alibi never added up. You had the motive, Eleanor's fortune. Ambition can drive a man to dangerous lengths. Patrick's face flushed, his voice rising defensively. That's absurd. Yes, I stood to gain if Eleanor inherited the fortune, but I would never. Enough, Olivia snapped, silencing him. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a near whisper, each word laced with intensity. You've been hiding something, Patrick, and I will find out what. Patrick's hands clenched into fists, but he said nothing. The room was on edge, the air thick with suspicion. Olivia took a deep breath, her mind racing as she pieced the puzzle together. Then she turned to Eleanor, who sat pale and trembling in the corner, her wide eyes fixed on the detective. You've been quiet, Eleanor, Olivia said, her tone soft but probing. Too quiet. And I can't help but wonder why. Eleanor shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know what you mean. But Olivia wasn't fooled. The pieces were falling into place, and the truth was darker than she had imagined. Let me lay it out for everyone, Olivia said, stepping back to address the room. Marcus Fisher wasn't here by chance. He was hired to stage a murder. Eleanor, you hired him to make it look like someone tried to kill you, knowing it would secure your inheritance. The room erupted in disbelief, voices overlapping in a cacophony of shock. Eleanor's face went pale as the weight of Olivia's words sank in. But Marcus wasn't loyal. Olivia continued, her voice cutting through the noise. He saw an opportunity and decided to blackmail you. That's when your plan started to fall apart, Eleanor. In a moment of desperation, you killed him. And Dr. Simon. He must have figured it out seen through your charade. That's why you poisoned him. Eleanor's trembling hands gripped the armrests of her chair, her breathing shallow. You are wrong, she stammered, her voice shaking. Two didn't. Olivia stepped closer, her eyes boring into Eleanor's. Stop lying. The evidence is all there. The rare poison. You had access to it through your family's estate. The staged blackout. Marcus didn't have the resources to pull that off alone. You orchestrated everything. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, and for a moment, it seemed as though she might deny it again. But then her expression shifted her. Fear gave way to something colder, darker. She straightened in her chair, her trembling replaced by a chilling calm. You think you are so clever, Detective, Eleanor said, her voice low and venomous. But you don't understand. I did what I had to do. Do you know what it's like to live your whole life under someone else's shadow? To be told you are nothing without your family's name and fortune. Marcus was a fool. He thought he could betray me, blackmail me. He didn't realize who he was dealing with. The room fell deathly silent. Everyone stared at Eleanor in stunned disbelief as her confession hung in the air. Olivia's jaw tightened, her heart pounding. And Dr. Simon, what was his crime? Eleanor's lips twisted into a bitter smile. He was too curious for his own good. He started asking questions, snooping where he didn't belong. I couldn't risk him ruining everything. Before Olivia could respond, Eleanor shot to her feet, grabbing a letter opener from the desk. The room froze as she held it in front of her, a wild look in her eyes. Stay back, she shouted, her voice trembling. You don't understand. None of you understand. Eleanor, Olivia said, her voice calm but firm. This isn't the way. It's over. Put the knife down. For a moment it seemed as though Eleanor might lash out, but then her shoulders sagged, the fight draining from her. The letter opener slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor. She sank back into the chair, her face a mask of despair. Cliffhanger ending. As the police led Eleanor away, Olivia felt a pang of unease. Something about the case still didn't sit right. She stared at the darkened windows of Blackwood House, the storm still raging outside. Then her phone buzzed. A text message. She pulled it out and read the words, her blood running cold. "You've only uncovered half the truth. Come back inside if you want to know the rest." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She turned back toward the house, its shadow looming ominously in the storm. What had she missed? What was still lurking in the darkness? The climax. The storm outside Blackwood House reached its peak, lightning illuminating the darkened hallways in bursts of electric fury. Detective Olivia Hart stood in the grand foyer, her pulse steady despite the chaos. Eleanor had slipped away in the confusion, but Olivia knew exactly where to find her. The old greenhouse at the edge of the estate was a maze of shattered glass and overgrown ivy. As Olivia pushed the creaking door open, the scent of damp earth and decay filled her lungs. In the center of the greenhouse, Eleanor stood, her back to the detective, her hands trembling as she clutched a rusted key. "Running won't help, Eleanor," Olivia said, her voice echoing in the hollow space. She stepped forward, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the shadows. "It's over. There's nowhere left to hide." Eleanor turned slowly, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes glinted with defiance. "You think you've figured it all out, don't you?" she said, her voice wavering but sharp. "But you don't know the half of it, detective." Olivia tilted her head, watching Eleanor carefully. "Then why don't you enlighten me?" Eleanor laughed bitterly, her shoulders shaking. "My entire life has been a performance," she said, gesturing around her as if the crumbling greenhouse were a stage. The perfect daughter, the grieving victim, the unassuming heiress. But underneath it all, lies. Every moment, every word, built on deceit. "And the murders," Olivia pressed. "Marcus Fisher, Dr. Simonded, they deserve to pay for those lies." Eleanor's expression hardened. "Marcus betrayed me. He thought he could use me, blackmail me, like I was some naive fool. And Simon was a loose end. I couldn't let him ruin everything I worked for." Olivia took another step closer, her voice calm but firm. "You mean everything you killed for? The inheritance, the fortunate was worth all this bloodshed?" Eleanor's laugh turned into a sob. "You think I did this for the money? That fortune is cursed. My family's legacy is nothing but death and ruin. Every coin, every acre of land, soaked in blood. I wanted to burn it all down, to finally escape from it, but I didn't know how." Olivia's sharp eyes caught a flicker of movement in Eleanor's hand, inching toward the key she had dropped at her feet. "Don't do it," Olivia warned, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Eleanor froze, her fingers trembling over the key. "What difference does it make?" she whispered. "Even if you take me away, this house, this legacy, it will never let me go." From the shadows, the remaining guests appeared, their faces pale and drawn. Julia, Patrick, and Dora stood in silent judgment, their presence like ghosts haunting Eleanor's final moments. "You don't get to escape this," Julia said, her voice steady despite the quiver in her hands. "Not after everything you've done." Eleanor looked at them, then back at Olivia. For a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of rain pounding against the greenhouse roof. Then, with a resigned sigh, Eleanor sank to her knees, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her crimes had finally crushed her. "I confess," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I did it. All of it." Olivia approached slowly, pulling out her handcuffs. "Eleanor Blackwood, you are under arrest for the murders of Marcus Fisher and Dr. Simon." Her tone was firm but tinged with a sadness she couldn't shake. "You didn't have to become a part of this curse, Eleanor. You had a choice." As Eleanor was escorted out of the greenhouse, the villagers gathered outside the gates, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. Blackwood House had always been a source of intrigue and mystery, but no one had imagined the darkness that lay within its walls. Olivia paused at the edge of the estate, watching the house as it loomed in the rain. She thought of all the lives that had been destroyed, the secrets that had been unearthed. In the quiet moments before she turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something left unsaid, something hidden in the shadows of Blackwood House. Cliffhanger ending. As Olivia walked toward her car, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, frowning as an unknown number flashed on the screen. She hesitated for a moment, then answered. "Detective Hart," she said, her voice cautious. A deep, distorted voice crackled through the line. "You think it's over, Detective. You've only just scratched the surface. The Blackwood curse isn't done with you yet." The line went dead. Olivia's heart raced as she stared at her phone, the storm raging on around her. She looked back at the house, its silhouette dark and foreboding against the lightning-lit sky. Somewhere inside, another secret was waiting, a secret that could change everything. Who do you think is the real killer? Comment below and let us know. If you love mystery and thrillers, hit subscribe for more.